I wanted to make a quick video about the concept of cults. And if I'm going to be putting out videos regularly, I can't be making slides for all of them because that's a really time-consuming endeavor. So I'm just going to show some footage of me playing StarCraft or whatever, and then just have some talking, and you can tab out, or if you're super interested in watching a complete amateur goof around in StarCraft rather than actually get good, then you could watch whatever. So, the idea of cults. I want to bring a rational critique of the sort of anti-cult movement in some ways. And what really brought this on is a fellow internet apologist for the idea of believing in God, Mr. Dean Esmay, who I think is a real embarrassment to theists everywhere. He spends a lot of his time being extremely rude to atheists on Twitter. And if I, the guy with a video on his channel that's entitled "Atheists Don't Have Ethics," say that you're being unnecessarily rude, then you have to be pretty rude. In addition, he just can't get along with anyone who doesn't share all of his opinions about just about everything, who doesn't belong to his specific branch of Catholicism. First, he starts this escaping atheism group on Facebook, and then he says, oh, maybe we should purge everyone who believes in sola scriptura. And then I say, oh, I'm a Latter-day Saint, and we agree that sola scriptura is a bad idea. And then I get banned for, quote, proselytizing, unquote, Latter-day Saintism. And then when I ask him, what's going on? What was all that about? He sends me a rude message on Facebook saying that my religion is, quote, satanic, unquote, as if I couldn't say the same thing about his Catholicism based on the historical interpretation of John the Revelator. But that wouldn't exactly help, would it? Saying somebody's religion is satanic when they obviously don't call themselves Satanists is unlikely to persuade anyone of anything. But I do have a larger point than just butthurt and calling out another YouTube theist on his misbehavior, and that is the idea of cults. There's a strong tendency in religious groups, especially in America, to describe any religious group that disagrees with theirs, especially a smaller one than theirs, as a, quote, cult, unquote, while their own religion is, quote, not a cult, unquote. From context clues, one would suppose that the word cult has no form that is proper to use in the first person. It's always only used in the third person. Their cult, or his cult, or her cult. It's never our cult, or my cult. That's because the word cult has become a pejorative. This wasn't always historically the case, however. Prior to the 20th century anti-cult movement, the word cult was considered to be synonymous with religious group, sect, denomination, church, etc. It's only in the 20th century that out of this pool of basically synonymous terms, which all refer to the same thing, we've chosen one of these terms, cult, to refer to all of these things pejoratively. This is largely due to the 20th century anti-cult movement, which was largely a response by Protestant evangelicals to the challenges posed by new religious movements. Because apparently new Christian churches founded in the 19th century are just fundamentally different from those founded in the 16th century. The ones in the 16th century, if they disagree with us, then, well, that's just a disagreement. But if they're in the 19th century and they disagree with us, why, then they're satanic. This does go beyond the evangelicals, however. I mean, there's Catholics like Dean Esmay who will call anyone who disagrees with him members of a cult. But then there's also atheists who use it, like, for example, Sargon of Akkad says that feminism is a cult, as if his own followers couldn't just as easily be described in the same way on the exact same grounds. The term cult seems to be what any large and well-established worldview calls any small and relatively new worldview. Critics of this video who support the anti-cult movement are, of course, going to respond that, quote, everyone say it with me, "The definition of a cult is clear," unquote. They always say that, and it's never true. Now, some individuals come up with a definition of cult that does work for them, but there is no common definition of cult that everyone can agree on. Now, there are just too many different definitions of cult for me to cover each individual one that's ever been proposed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break the different definitions of cult down into categories and explain why each category tends very strongly towards fallacy. But first, let's cut to the chase. Rather than talk about the definition right away, first I want to talk about the rhetorical implication. When somebody says you're in a cult, the rhetorical implication is always that you belong to a group that is similar in some way to the People's Temple movement of Jim Jones in 1978. That's always what it means when you get to the end. Also Heaven's Gate in 1997, but it's mainly Jamestown in 1978 that really formed this trope or tendency in rhetoric. That's where the famous catchphrase, "Don't drink the Kool-Aid," comes from, is that 1978 incident where a bunch of people deliberately drank poisoned Kool-Aid in order to commit mass suicide. And it was actually not Kool-Aid. The Kool-Aid Corporation is very insistent that it was Flavor Aid. Anyway, all of these definitions are aimed at getting to make that rhetorical comparison. Getting to categorize people you don't like with people who are crazy enough to commit mass suicide. That's what they're all trying to do. Because that's what the popular culture meaning of the term cult is. That's what a cult is on South Park. Okay, that's what a cult is if you hear cult on the news. That's generally what they mean when they say cult. And I suppose that definition of cult is kind of clear, but it's just not true of anyone except the actual mass suicide people, and there are very, very few of those. And by the way, Jim Jones, the People's Temple guy, he was a Marxist, which means he was an atheist. So the People's Temple mass suicide could very well be argued to have been caused by atheism. So this whole idea that there's this strong tendency inherent in various religions towards mass suicide is just not true on so many levels. But before someone comes in with, "But that's a straw man, no one really advocates that," I'd have to say, shut up. You've never been on the receiving end of this. I have. I've met people who do this. Using cult as a pejorative is saying this to your audience. No matter what your definition of a cult technically is, that's what you're saying in rhetoric. And it's dishonest. Unless you're talking about the actual mass suicide groups, which usually people aren't. Okay, so first let's talk about how I define a cult, and I don't. I say extreme religious group if I want to talk about extreme religious groups, but I don't say cult because the term cult, as we will see, is fraught with conceptual difficulties. So I'd suggest just saying extreme religious group if that's what you mean. But sometimes I forget. I screw up and I still say cult, and I don't have a perfect memory. I don't always remember the conclusion of every philosophical inquiry I've ever made. And so, yeah, sometimes I'll engage in this same rhetoric myself, and because I've forgotten that it's fallacious and I've concluded elsewhere that it's fallacious. So if you ever catch me doing it, then you can just link this video and say, "Hey, you said that you shouldn't do that." And I'll be like, "Oh yeah, I forgot. Good catch. Good point." So I'm not saying that every single time anyone ever uses the term cult pejoratively, they're necessarily being malicious. Sometimes I'll even use it on purpose in order to respond to someone else who is using the term. I'll be analyzing their argument, and I will use the term because they used it. And sometimes I will say, if you're going to say this is a cult, well, then this is also a cult by that same logic, So what I'm saying, though, is that, from myself, from my own ideology, I try to simply get rid of the word cult entirely because there's just no one clear way to understand what it means. And I'm going to be going over the list of different categories now. These are the categories of proposed definitions of the term cult to help distinguish what is a cult from what is not. These are all tests. How do you tell whether it's a cult or not? And you have to apply these definitions to find out. So the first category of these various cult tests would be the doctrinal definition of cult. A cult is a group under this definition which disagrees with us about some point of doctrine. I find this definition of cult to be most common among Protestant evangelicals, who will say that anyone who disagrees with them about the authority of the Bible, or doesn't view the authority of the Bible in the same way that they do through their Lutheran doctrine of sola scriptura, it's not just for what we call Lutherans, but for the entire Protestant Reformation, they all hold to the doctrine of sola scriptura, and they say that anyone who doesn't hold to the doctrine of sola scriptura is a cult, or in a cult. Of course, the problem with this definition is it makes the definition of cult centered on their own theology. And so this definition of cult is, of course, useless to anyone outside of the circle of orthodoxy that they're trying to use it to establish. And so this definition is very self-serving whenever it appears. Of course, another conceptual problem with it for Protestant evangelicals within Protestantism is that under this definition, not only are Mormons cultists, but so are Catholics. And if you're going to say that the Catholic Church is a cult, then yeah, you're pretty much saying anybody who disagrees with you is a cultist. And that's dishonest because it's comparing everybody who disagrees with you to Jim Jones, ultimately. So there's a problem with that. But it's not only religious people who engage in the doctrinal definition of cult. You will find the same thing with atheists who use the doctrinal definition of cult to define all religions as cults, and thus say that all religions belong in the same category with Jim Jones and the People's Temple and the Kool-Aid drinkers. And you'll find this, the new atheists do this, and the cultural libertarians on YouTube will occasionally do this. They will say that, feminism is a cult, and then they will say, just like the religious right. As if, the religious right and feminism are both exactly like Jim Jones and the People's Temple and the Kool-Aid drinkers, but they aren't, of course. So, yeah, trying to define a cult in terms of a set of doctrines and adhering or not adhering to a set of doctrines is going to be fraught with difficulties. It's going to always be serving the agenda of the people who are making that definition, but it's going to be useless to anyone who doesn't share that agenda. So that pretty much wraps it up for the doctrinal definition of a cult. Then we have to look at the behavioral definition of a cult, which is cults are groups that exhibit behaviors from some list. And the list will have things like they have a single leader that everyone follows, they have a set of teachings that everyone is expected to conform to or to learn about, they have a strong sense of community, they have, and then some lists will then start to mix in a few things from the Jim Jones People's Temple Kool-Aid drinker stereotype, which from this point on I'll just call the Kool-Aid drinker stereotype. So they'll have Kool-Aid drinker things like expecting you to sell all of your possessions and donate your money to the group, or just asking you generally to donate money to the group, asking you to share the group's beliefs with your neighbors, things that are all behaviors. And so there'll be, a large number of fairly innocuous things on such a list, and then there will be a few, really nasty things that only the most extreme groups do. Or just a few really strange things, like having a bunker and stocking up on guns, will be in the list. And then people who support the behavioral definition of a cult will say, well, in order to be a cult, you don't have to do all of the things on the list. that means they get to put the most extreme groups who do the extreme things on the list in the same category with completely innocuous groups who only do maybe just a few of the least extreme, perfectly normal things on the list that most religions do, or most schools of thought even do. So the behavioral definition of cult is just completely open to manipulation, and to anyone using that type of definition, I'd have to say, no, we don't want genus, we want species. We don't want to know the accidental properties that cults tend to have. We want to know what the essential properties of a cult are. We don't want to know the general sorts of things cults tend to do. We want to know what are the minimum requirements to be a cult by which we can tell a cult from a non-cult. Which means that anything on your list that's part of your definition, which not all the groups do, is irrelevant. Now, if you can get the definition that is a behavioral definition by questioning the person who's proposing it down to a real definition that actually has minimum requirements instead of just sort of general stuff, you actually get down to these are the things you absolutely have to have. And if you don't have all of these, then you're not a cult. Then we find one of two things. Either the number of cultists in the world is extremely small, so small that they're hardly worth talking about, or the number of cultists in the world is so huge that being in a cult can't really be all that bad of a thing to be. And by the way, in a behavioral-based definition of cult, if any of the behaviors include the term religious, or in any way exclude atheism, then it isn't really a solely behavior-based definition of cult. It's actually a doctrinal-based definition of cult, and that gives you all the problems in the first category of doctrinal definitions, in addition to any problems that you get from being a behavioral-based definition. And that, of course, gives us the third category, the hybrid definition of a cult, in which being a cult involves a combination of doctrinal factors and behavioral factors. And this is even worse because it has the problems from both. It is nice for a definition to include more information, it makes it more specific, but including both does not cause the problems with the doctrinal definition and the problems with the behavioral definition to go away. The problems don't fix each other, they multiply. Finally, there is the popularity-based definition of a cult. And this is the idea that cults are simply unpopular ideological groups. So this is not based on something they believe or based on something that they do, but based on the results of how society treats them. Essentially, people are in a cult if society treats them like they are in a cult because of their being unpopular. So this definition actually works pretty well to describe the people that I think that the anti-cult movement wants to attack, and not describing people that they don't want to attack, except that this is a completely non-pejorative definition, and so using it pejoratively, using it to do that rhetorical comparison I mentioned earlier, is engaging in the ad populum fallacy. And yeah, even though I have a series called Not a Fallacy on my channel, I do still believe that there are real fallacies, and ad populum is one of them. And that is, of course, on top of the association fallacy, which most pejorative terms lend themselves to very easily. So there are problems with all of these definitions of cult, and none of them really justify using the term cult in the way that it gets used. Whenever somebody tries to define cult, cult is either defined in an extremely self-serving way for their own particular ideology, or it describes almost no one and becomes an almost useless term, or it describes nearly everyone and becomes an almost useless term. There's a strong tendency in discussions about cults to take what are really very ordinary human behaviors that all religions do or have done at some point and describe them in a very scary, menacing sort of way. And this lends itself very easily to atheism. I mean, the atheists love this term, cult, because they know that it's a weapon that they can turn on any group that they don't like, and it sounds a lot less credible to say that atheists can be in a cult, mainly because people aren't really aware of the actual ideology of the People's Temple group. So an atheist who reads up on the anti-cult literature will very quickly see that, hey, wait a minute, if we remove all of the theological aspects of what it means to be a cult and look strictly at the behavior, then we've got a list of behaviors that pretty much describe all religious people. That means all religious people are just like cultists. And see, that's a very self-serving narrative for the atheist, but then you have to realize that if you really remove all of the behavioral aspects, including the description of the various behaviors as religious, then it also expands to cover atheist groups too. And so it pretty much covers just about everyone. It's how human societies work. They have leaders, they have social expectations, they have a strong sense of community, they pool their money. Humans do this stuff. Now, on the other hand, I do not want people to think that I'm saying that there are no extreme religious groups out there who are seriously dangerous, because there are some. And in fact, there are some Latter-day Saint groups that are extremely dangerous. I'm thinking specifically of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Fundamentalist is actually what they call themselves. The initials are FLDS. And they're a group in Utah who have stuck with the Brighamite belief in polygamy and taken it to some real extremes where they have these compounds and they marry underage girls and they occasionally get raided by the feds. And even though I'm a Latter-day Saint myself, I totally support the feds, and I think that their raiding the FLDS generally has been pretty much in the right, because the FLDS situation is child abuse and really shouldn't be allowed in a civilized society. And of course, it's really sad how it all works, because the children who end up getting taken away from the FLDS, well, that's been their family their whole life, and so they're, very committed to it for somewhat understandable reasons, because, it's their family. So, it's very scary, because we have this abusive relationship, and yet we have, people who, it's super complicated, but yeah, I don't think you're in a cult is exactly going to be a way to help anyone, though. I really don't think that is a helpful term, because even people who are in the real extreme religious groups, you're just going to be turning them off by insulting them that way, because even the FLDS aren't about to commit mass suicide. So yeah, there are real extreme religious groups, and sometimes the government does have to raid them. By the way, I'm not making any endorsement of government raids on the compound in Waco, Texas. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about the raids on the FLDS. I think were justified. So I might say a little bit at the end here about my own experience as a Latter-day Saint. I'm a member of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or what's left of it after it experienced a huge schism in the 1980s over the issue of social justice whiners invading the church and replacing it with a bunch of left-wing politics, which took the form of the issue of women in the priesthood, though of course the real issue was feminism and moral relativism, and women in the priesthood was just the occasion on which our mettle was going to be tested of whether we were going to give in to feminism and moral relativism or not. And of course, I belong to the conservative faction, which clearly did not, and formed what is now known as the Restoration Branches Movement, which is a sort of loosely associated group of individual congregations that all try to hold to the doctrines of the church from before the split, i.e. the real doctrines, not the replacement of them with left-wing politics. And so I am on the one hand hated by the mainstream Christians, especially Protestant evangelicals, for not being a Protestant evangelical. really for being a Mormon, hated for being a Mormon, and then I'm hated by the Mormons for not being a Mormon, because I'm a member of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and not just the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and so I don't believe in polygamy, or secret temple rituals, or magic underwear, or other planets, or a number of other rather strange doctrines of the Brighamites in Utah. Although I do believe in the Book of Mormon, and I do plan on making videos about the Book of Mormon at some point on my channel, mainly just to inform people about what's in it and how magic underwear is most definitely not in it. Anyway, so about this whole issue, what mainstream Christians will almost always say is, you're in a cult. I get that all the time, and I'm just tired of hearing that, and that's really a big part of what brought this video on. It's an extremely common response, is that you're in a cult. And then because they've developed programs of anti-cult apologetics that deal with Utah Mormons, the Brighamite Mormons, the mainstream Mormon church you've probably heard of, who tend to knock on your door, the mainstream Christians will, first of all, their strategy is basically to try to turn RLDS people into Mormons by trying to prove that the Mormon theology, the Brighamite theology, is the correct Latter-day Saint theology, and then try to refute the Brighamite theology, because they can't actually deal with the RLDS theology. And where there is actual anti-RLDS stuff from the anti-cult people, it's usually a bunch of nonsense. One of which, I remember there was a book, I forget what it's called. I can probably get it. If I can find it again, I'll get a link to it in the description. It was by Carol Hansen, who's an anti-RLDS, anti-cult person. And she described someone who I know and have met personally, High Priest Paul Gage. She accused him of having engaged in a secret ritual in which he put a bag over his head and said, "I am in darkness and must be led to the light of Freemasonry," or something to that effect. This is from memory. I don't have the book in front of me, sadly. But yes, I've met that guy, and there's no way I can see him doing that. There's just no way. I don't believe I don't believe that he'd do that. Frankly, I don't think he's humble enough to even do that. So yeah, that's pretty ridiculous. And so you see, and by the way, I have little to no loyalty to Mr. Gage, other than he's I think he's a fellow Christian, and but I don't see him as having a sort of higher rank than I have, where he can tell me what to do at all in the church. And so I'm not defending a cult leader there. The Restoration Branches movement has no single leader. It's too divided to do that, and it actually could use one. I suppose you might be able to make a better cult comparison once we actually get a single leader, but we don't even have one. So all this anti-cult stuff, it does get on my nerves. But then there's another side to this, and this is the last thing I'd like to say about the whole cult issue, and that is, being a Latter-day Saint, I know what it's like to be rejected by the mainstream Christian religious political right, for the most part. At least until Mitt Romney was running for president, even to some extent while Mitt Romney was running for president, there is this extreme prejudice against Latter-day Saints from especially from Protestant evangelicals that you encounter quite often. And of course, not all Protestant evangelicals, some of them are cool, but some of them go to this, go beyond doctrinal disagreement into just the sort of lying. And when it comes to the Brighamite Mormons, I might say, to some of these people that, there are some genuinely strange things that the Brighamite Mormons believe, like the magic underwear and the secret temple rituals and the other planets. Those things actually happen. So why do the Protestant evangelicals find the need to make up lies in addition to the strange things that your Brighamite Mormons actually believe? There are things that the Brighamite Mormons actually believe that are genuinely strange, and they're strange enough that you don't have to make up lies about them in order to say that they're really strange. But lies and myths persist anyway, so I might end up talking about some of those on my channel in future. But I might say that I know what it's like to be hated by the religious establishment, because like I said, I don't fit in with the mainstream Christians, and I don't fit in with the Mormons, because I don't belong to either one of those groups. And I get called a Satanist and a cultist by mainstream Christians quite often. And that's rather worse than being called a homosexual, which is what homosexuals are. So I might say a lot of this whining about how marginalized, homosexuals are or whatever, because they don't get to belong to the same club as the conservative religious right. The conservative religious right doesn't like you. Boo-hoo. I'm like, well, yeah, I know what that's like, and that's ridiculous. I mean, of course, I haven't been rejected by my own family. That's different. But this general whining about being marginalized by the religious right, shut up. Seriously, it's not a big deal. It's annoying, but it's not soul-crushing. All right, so that's all I have to say. Thanks very much.